All right. Well, welcome everyone to this lecture of the Western Illinois Society of the American Institute of Archaeology. It's our great pleasure this evening to host Professor Douglas Bamforth of the University of Colorado, and a particular pleasure for me since my undergraduate degree is from the University of Colorado, where I was an anthropology major, double major with classics. And so I got to work with Doug then, and it's just a great pleasure to be able to host him this evening for tonight's lecture. Professor Bamforth came to the University of Colorado after working at a couple of other places, but he had earned his PhD from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And he had gone to the West Coast from the East Coast. He had started out with his bachelor's degree at the University of Pennsylvania, but it had obviously a long-standing interest in the human past. He's gone on during his career at the University of Colorado to publish many articles and books, most of them having to do with his work as the project director of the Medicine Creek Paleo-Indian Project. Many of his publications also reflect his interest in lithics and the analysis of lithics, and we may get some of that tonight, although maybe not a huge amount. No? Okay, never mind then. You'll have to ask him about it afterwards. This lecture is brought to you, tonight we are recording the lecture, but the lecture is brought to you by as I said, the American Institute of Archaeology. And it's part of the AIA's National Lecture Program. This is part of the AIA's mission to educate people about the human past. It's the North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization, and it supports not only academic archaeologists, but also educators at a variety of levels, excavations around the world, the publication of archaeological material. It's really a wonderful organization, and probably known best for its popular publication, Archaeology magazine. You can, when you join the AIA, you get a membership, you get with your membership a subscription to Archaeology magazine, either digital or print. And if you pay a little bit more money, you can also get the American Journal of Archaeology, which is the world's leading journal for Mediterranean archaeology. And in general, the AIA just supports various kinds of engagement with the human past, and through lectures such as the one you'll hear tonight, but also archaeology fairs, field trips, and maintaining lists of fieldwork opportunities around the world. So I would encourage you, if you aren't yet a member of the AIA, to become one. I've enjoyed over many years having been a member and having had the opportunity to come to lectures like the one you'll have tonight. All right, so I also want to let you know that tonight's lecture is a special lecture. Oops, I didn't get the other. You have this stone slide in your presentation, right? Yes, okay. Tonight's lecture is a special lecture specifically on New World archaeology in memory of Doris Stone, who supported the AIA's work to bring information about the archaeology of the New World to AIA members. And without further ado then, I will turn things over to Professor Bamforth. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Cool. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. This is a great crowd. This is amazing. So I will do the share. This is the third different meeting system that I have been on in the last week. We did Google Groups and Microsoft Teams, and this is the one I'm used to. Danielle said, this is a really strange small world. It is just amazing. So when I realized who my host was for this one, it was remarkable. It's a strange small world to do a Doris Stone lecture too, because I Googled her. I did not know who she was. She worked in the intermediate area down in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, but she was associated with Chilean, where my uncle taught for decades and decades and decades and many decades. And so she must have known my family, which is just odd. Academia is a very insular kind of, I don't want to say incestuous, but a very tightly woven kind of place. And I've got my own lectures being recorded. So what I want to talk about today, the title is Central Plains Maize Farming in the Cahokian Diaspora. And I wrote this a year and a half ago. So because I was supposed to be doing this last year and everything got canceled. So I'm not sure that this is the same talk that I had in mind then, but it's for those of you who heard me last night, that was really focused down on a particular place. This is more of a bird's eye view of things. So there's less dirt in it and things like that. There's no magnetometers and that kind of thing. It's more, I'm trying to be more synthetic. So it's a little bit of a different, the course of it is a little bit different. And I want to start, we're going to talk about maize farming. That all looks way too big on my screen. So we'll see how this works. On the Great Plains, and I used to joke when we were working in Western Nebraska that we were working in Nebraska trying to find maize farmers, and people were like, how hard can that possibly be? Because they're everywhere. And what I want to talk about is the beginning of that. And it's an example of one of the biggest problems that archaeologists deal with. And I want to start up high. I want to start up with really big problems, which, if we think about human history, you can tick off 4 or 5 huge events that transformed society, right? They've transformed our history, peopling the world and all kinds of things like that. They're really big things. And one of the biggest, possibly the biggest, is the invention of food production, agriculture, plant and animal domestication. And we spend lots and lots and lots of time talking about the tiny handful of places where people invented it. And there's theory after theory after theory about that. And they're fairly sensible ideas. But the fact is that if you look at the history of humanity, right, those circles are the places where it was invented. They've left off Eastern North America completely unfairly. I just realized that when I was looking at it again today. I like the picture except for that. Agriculture was invented there, although they domesticated foods we don't much eat anymore, right? But if you look at the history of humanity writ large since the end of the Ice Age, right? At the end of the Pleistocene, everybody was a hunter and gatherer. However many millions of people were in the world, they were all hunters and gatherers. And today, essentially no one is. The next best thing to no one. The spread of agriculture is inexorable. The spread of agriculture happened continuously in pulses. It didn't happen at the same speed all the time, but where it has been face to face with hunting and gathering, it has never failed to replace hunting and gathering. And yet there's this tiny handful of places where it was invented. And that means that the dominant, if we want to think about food production and humanity, it's good to think about the invention of it. That's cool. Origins are cool in archaeology. But the fact is that if we want to understand human history, we've got to understand how it came to spread where it spread after it was invented, right? And it doesn't do that. It always replaces hunting and gathering. It doesn't always do it fast, and it doesn't always do it immediately. And it always, except for those handful of inventions, it always involves knowledgeable choice. It always, and people make those decisions and they make them knowledgeably, right? There's my other, this is the smaller version of this. No, it's my different one. So let's go to the Great Plains and think about this a little bit. That on the left is a map of a trade network from the early colonial era that crossed all of the Great Plains and in fact attached to networks that crossed most of North America, maybe all of North America. And they involved farmers and they involved many, many goods, lots and lots of goods, but they involved a lot of food. And they involved both farmers and hunters and gatherers systematically producing extra, more than they needed for themselves so that they could take it to trading centers and exchange it with their neighbors. They knew what they were going into those trading centers to get. They knew what they wanted. They knew what was going to be there. They understood completely the differences in the ways of life that they were meeting. The most famous is, Coronado's description of Plains Pueblo interaction at Pecos Pueblo, and not some of the other border pueblos where hunter-gatherers like the Apache came in and traded. They brought bison meat and hides and things like that in and traded for agricultural products and visited the pueblos. There was no question in their minds about what these lives were like, and yet they did not choose them, right? But this kind of interaction is widespread in the world, right? And it's a good illustration of this. Things don't spread right away, but they spread sooner or later, in a sense. This is a plains hunter-gatherer, two plains hunters and gatherers. This is Quanah Parker, and one of his, he had a remarkable number of wives. This is Tanarsi, was one of his wives. And this is a sort of a postcard shot, but Quanah Parker was a warrior. He was a superb warrior, but he was a hunter and gatherer. He was a bison hunter on the Southern High Plains. He was a Comanche, one of the last great Comanche chief before they went onto the reservation. Not a formal chief, but leader. And you can see what his life in sort of his clothing and in his, that if we could see more of his technology, you would see a hunter's technology. His home is a teepee, in this case, made out of canvas, but traditionally made out of bison hide, right? I mean, we can see it we can see his sort of choice of diet, if you want to think of it that way, written through all kinds of things that archaeologists can see. These are not hunters and gatherers, right? These are farmers. They're equally serious people, right? You cannot be confused, but these are farmers. And in the same way that Quanah Parker's life is written archaeologically in the picture on the left, so are these folks' lives written archaeologically in technology and residential architecture and clothing and everything else, right? So this is Quanah Parker and Tanarsi too. When he came into the reservation after 1876, the Comanches were moved up into southwestern Oklahoma, and Quanah became probably the most affluent Native American in North America. He was a successful rancher in the blink of an eye, right? In less than a generation, he made a choice to become someone engaged in food production, mostly ranching, right? This suits Plains Indians from the 19th century. Plains Indians would be pastoralists more than they would be farmers. But that choice that he made was almost instantaneous. And it's not the kind of choice, the conditions of life that led him to make that choice are not the kind of things that enter into most discussions of agriculture. We cannot understand what Quanah and Tanarsi did without stepping back from studies of subsistence and caloric returns on investment and all the kinds of things that enter into these conversations. We have to step back and look at the much larger social and economic and historical context that people lived in and made those choices in, because we're all enmeshed in these much larger webs. And they condition fundamentally our choices, even about something as practical as being a farmer or not. And I'm not going to say that we're looking at the same conditions that Quanah Parker faced in the late 1800s, but it's that much larger context, I think, is essential to understanding what happened on the Central Plains. Right? People can change their lives very quickly, and we make choices about changes in this complex web of local factors, very local factors, and these larger social and political and economic connections. So this is our brief outline. Now we're going to talk quickly about before maize farming on the Central Plains, woodland hunters and gatherers. And my only goal in doing that is to make it really, really clear that hunters and gatherers on the plains knew their neighbors for a really long time before they became farmers. And then I want to look at the Central Plains tradition, and then a quick overview of Cahokia, and then talk about these interconnections and look at the pace of change and the development of food production. So early woodland, you can find when there's this just along the very edge of the eastern edge of the plains, we find pottery and some other changes too, but that's the one that is really diagnostic of this period. And when you look at the pottery, it looks just like early woodland pottery in Illinois, for those of you who are in Illinois. Same kinds of designs, the same technology, specific, the comparisons that people make, not just in North Dakota, but down into eastern Kansas as well, are specific across to the Midwest. It's like it's called woodland because of the artifactual similarities between what we see on the Great Plains and what we see to the east. These were semi-sedentary woodland period hunters and gatherers that by about, say, AD, ballpark AD 1 or so, it spread this way of life, a way of life much like this, spread out across Nebraska and much of Kansas. And when we look at that, right, there are connections. We have Hopewell and we have Kansas City Hopewell. And Kansas City Hopewell is on the Great Plains, and they knew each other. I mean, these are not exactly the same pot, but you couldn't mistake, right? You can't mistake this design. When people in the Illinois River Valley or the Ohio River Valley changed their style of decorating their pots, when it was like, that's not cool style anymore, we do it this way now. People in the Kansas City area did the same thing. This was an ongoing pattern of interaction, and it's not an accident that it happened in the Kansas City area. That's where the Missouri River comes due west across the state of Missouri and then turns onto the Great Plains. There's this Plains woodland pottery on the left, North Carolina woodland pottery on the right. These conical, grit-tempered, cord-marked vessels, not identical, but so close that it's impossible. That there cannot have been some movement of ideas, and ideas move with people that span 2/3 of North America, right? These are people who are thinking almost identical pots. Right? So they're connected, and it's not that they're utterly dependent on one another, but everybody knows their neighbors and everybody interacts with their neighbors. And Middle Woodland people interacted in part by smoking together. And so on the left is a frog effigy pipe from a Hopewell site in Ohio. On the right it's in a private collection, but it's not quite as elegant a frog effigy, but a frog effigy pipe manufactured out of the local bedrock near Lexington, Nebraska, and which means that somebody understood the meaning of platform pipes and what you did with platform pipes to forge social connections. And these folks, we'll come back to the martial ossuary in a minute, but this changed in important ways, not just whether people made pots or what they looked like, but how they thought about community, how they marked community in mortuary ritual, because we see woodland style mounds and ossuaries from South Dakota spread out all the way across. There were probably a couple in Wyoming that are destroyed now, and all down through Nebraska and Kansas. This is one of them, the Marshall ossuary. You can see how they get destroyed. Area previously dug and refilled was referring to local people who were interested in it. But this is a pit excavated. Can you go? Yikes, that was not the right thing. Can you see my cursor when I move it? Cool, that didn't work on Microsoft Teams. Zoom is so much better, right? So we've got an ossuary pit here with smaller pits marked in the ground, and people would bury large numbers of their relatives, presumably, who in secondary. These are not people laid out on the ground the way we bury people. These are secondary people mostly, in sort of large collective interments, which speaks to something important about society. And it's not that different from folks to the east. And they were engaged. Here's that colonial era map, but that network began to be constructed during woodland times, and it changed the lives of people on the plains and probably changed the lives of their neighbors. That, as you can see, sites like this huge industrial scale bison jump up in Saskatchewan that was used over and over for hundreds of years, right? Massive overproduction. So we can see these people woven into communities of economic communities and religious kind of communities and other kinds of communities that span these enormous areas, right? And until the late 1100s, that's what there was on the Central Plains. There's been a lot of debate over exactly when farming appeared, but the revision, the most recent revisions using the most precise, carefully selected materials for radiocarbon dates have knocked out all of the early stuff. And it really looks as though when you match these radiocarbon dates against diagnostic artifacts from outside the plains, it's really clear that this doesn't date any earlier than the mid to late 1100s. After that time, we see the earliest farmers in a couple of places, right around the Kansas City area, out into east central Kansas. And then there's one date hidden underneath that black and white photograph that suggests that there may have been some early communities up in southwestern Nebraska as well. And we'll call them the Central Plains tradition. There's a Central Plains, sort of a typical Central Plains tradition pot. If you saw me last night, there's parallel horizontal lines around that. That's just like the lynch pot. That's not the lynch pot, that's another one. But these small scattered horticultural communities all across, well, in these areas, at first, and then from the sort of early 1200s or so up to 1400s, expanding over most of the Central Plains. So there's a pulse of settlement early, and then it kind of sits there, and then it goes. And when I say all over the Central Plains, just to give you a sense, that map up in the upper left is Nebraska, and it's a few years old now, but the Central Plains tradition sites that are in the state database. And they're clinging to these drainages because they're agriculturalists putting their crops in the floodplain, but they're very distinctive and they're everywhere. And there's lots of these sites. You can see the distinctive kind of architecture in the reconstructions on the left and the size of some of the houses in that photograph in the bottom center. Right? These are fairly large, roughly square to rectangular, four center posts, storage pits inside and outside. Very, very characteristic architecture. Very, very characteristic ceramic pattern, not ornate, but easy to recognize in a lot of ways, and absolutely maize horticulturalists. You can see that in those corn cobs. In the West, they built these houses pretty much on the ground surface. So they're not all exactly the same. When you get far enough out west and there's no big trees, you build smaller houses because you can't roof big houses and you can't support heavy roofs. So there's local variability in these things, but it's all variations on a theme. Right? To the east, houses are often more deeply excavated into the ground. Some of them are as deep as a meter. So they're verging on pit houses. But all the same kind of architecture. Very distinctive. Some of their lithic technology is very distinctive. I'll only talk a tiny little bit about stone tools in here. I actually talked about pottery last night. Danielle, you would have been surprised. But these diamond bevel knives, so they had these characteristic large knives, probably set in bone handles. And as they resharpened them, they took on this diamond shape and got beveled. And you can see the bevel right here. That's what you get when they're not useful anymore, and these big ones are what they look like when they're just started. And then an assortment of other things, little fish effigies and things like that. So these are clusters of farmers in just a few houses at a time that sit on terraces above the floodplains, usually of the smaller rivers and their tributaries, although they've been found in some other places too. Large clusters of these houses don't always and usually don't mean large towns. Many of what we seem to see are people living in small scattered communities and using and reusing the same localities sometimes. So these are, I think sometimes that the dominant sort of settlement pattern in modern rural Nebraska is not a bad model for some of this, where you see farmhouses scattered across the landscape, not towns. There were towns, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So, quick recap, begins in the late 1100s in the southeastern part of the Central Plains. It expanded in the 1200s and 1300s across most of the Central Plains, and then it disappeared by 1400 or a little bit after. There's some good evidence that it persisted a little bit later than that. Okay, so that's all out here. I want to look quickly at Cahokia and then glance at Spiro, right? The theme is everybody knows their neighbors, and we can see that, and we affect each other all the time, right? So Cahokia, everybody knows Cahokia, especially all the people in Illinois. This huge, densely populated center. I always throw this one in with this red. We have all these, even the reconstructions are like this. It's all, when you go and visit it, it's lovely and grassy and green, which is, I think, not at all what it looked like when people built it. That's all sort of modern pastoral kinds of things. They were plastered with clay This one is down in Georgia where the clay is red, but I think we make them look more serene than they actually were at the time. But this huge center affected all of the world around it, right? It had this very distinctive pottery. They had a variety of distinctive pottery, but Raymie pottery was part of it. And I've lost, have I lost a slide? No, okay. I did lose a slide, sorry. So it starts up at AD 1050 on most people's accounts. And from the very beginnings of it, people refer to as the Loman Phase for about 50 years. So that's a hard period of time to date with radiocarbon, but that's the best guess. So they refer, Tim Pocketet and other people refer to the Big Bang, which is to say there were not a lot of people in the area, the American bottom where the site of Cahokia is, in AD 1000, and there were an enormous number of people there after 1050, and they were obviously organized into a very in a very orderly kind of community, and the rapidity of that change tells us a lot. I mean, it tells us that something important happened that we still don't, I think, understand, but it also tells us that we're not looking at in-place population change. We're looking at people moving in. And I think I do have a slide later that mentions, but there's excellent evidence that people moved into Cahokia. We know that you couldn't build that community any other way. So as they did that, they designed this pottery, which is thought was pretty clearly has some kind of special religious significance. This fourfold symmetry around the pot, around the orifice of the pot, so you're kind of reaching through something that's probably symbolizes the world we're in, from the upper to the lower world. This is not my stuff, but it's clearly an important style of ceramic in the community of Cahokia and way beyond Cahokia itself. There's also this really distinctive architecture. So just before Loman times, people built these slightly subterranean houses with single set post walls. And so you see all of the posts that the wall posts, all the holes that the wall posts were set in. And as you're building that, then you're taking these posts, setting each one in the ground, and then bending them over, and then fastening to them at the top. And they bend over this internal frame. And that's a fair amount of work, right? So each post gets individual, each hole is crafted for each individual post, and that's how you build your house. And then you sleep inside. They're quite small. You can see from 1 meter scale. From the Loman Phase on, that changed. And they made what are called wall trench houses. So instead of taking each post and putting it in place, what it looks like that builders were doing was taking a long post and setting and prefabbing the walls. So that they would call them panelizing today, where they build most of your house in a factory and bring it out to the house, to the job site, and just bolt it together. And it's kind of an ancient version of that. And so you dig these one long trench, you set the wall in it, you attach them in the corners, and then you build something that's very, very close to the same house, right? Once this is thatched, it would be really difficult to tell how that thing was built, and to know whether it was different than this one or that one. It's got the same kind of internal weight-bearing structure, right? It's got the same banked walls on the outside. There's some subtle differences, but you'd really have to know what you're looking at to understand that you were looking at a wall trench house. It's very distinctive of Cahokia. And in fact, it spreads out from Cahokia over time. After it was built, rather quickly to the north, somewhat more slowly to the east, and down to the south. They take a lot of credit for every wall trench in the southeastern United States, but they might be right. It's hard to say. You'll notice that the Great Plains are conspicuously not on here, except for Cahokia. They reached out in lots of other ways as well. So this is some of the famous. This is a Flint clay figurine. All of these, they're pipes, or sometimes they're statues that have been remade into pipes. They're all made at Cahokia. Every single one of them has been shown to be made at Cahokia, and they're distributed over much of the Mississippi River Valley, along with those Raymie pots, and they do have the Great Plains on here. So they came all the way down into Oklahoma, they came across into northwestern Iowa and up to the Great Lakes, down into Louisiana. That was all I needed to say. And we see this distinctive iconography on a lot of both Cahokian and later Mississippian artifacts in pottery and in these shelved discs. And this is a drawing of a Ray Broussais copper plaque. And you see this kind of forked eye surround, and this is a warrior. Just as an aside, there's an introductory textbook that describes this image as a shaman bearing the effigy of a head, and what it looks like to most people is a warrior bearing the head of his deceased enemy. So you can sort of tweak exactly the meaning of all this, but there's general agreement that these are warrior images, and you can see that same forked eye surround here, and it mimics a falcon, right? This is a peregrine, and this is falcon and other raptor kind of imagery that's linked to elite male warrior status. And it's very visible, not just at Cahokia, absolutely down into Spiro and across much of the Mississippi and Southeast. Well, also, you'll see why I made a point of including this. This is from Moundville. This is not from either of the sites I said I was going to talk about. This Moundville is in Alabama and Georgia. Now I'm blanking. But what you see is a rattlesnake tied in knots, a horned rattlesnake. It's not just any rattlesnake. And this hand-eye representation. And imagery like this is an important part of the iconography of Mississippian society later, a little bit later than Cahokia. Okay, real quick glance at Spiro down in eastern Oklahoma. Spiro and houses look like this. These are the wall trenches that I think the Cahokian archaeologists are trying to take credit for, even though they're not wall trenches, they're entry passageway trenches, and they're not on residential structures. Houses with these kinds of entryways are found underneath mounds at Spiro, so they served some kind of special purpose. Everyday houses were much more like this, with just a doorway in the wall. These are later. These two-post houses are later in time. Spiro and pottery is quite distinctive. This is called curvilinear and sized, and you can see these sort of punctate patterns here with these incised patterns here. Lots of swirling curvilinear kinds of designs, as well as some more angular designs. And I do like stone tools, and these are really cool stone tools. So at Spiro, there was this amazing collection of material found in one big mound, and it was a huge ceremonial event towards the end of the occupation, where they interred or reinterred objects from the entire occupation of this chiefly center. And among the things that they interred were bifaces like this. So this one is maybe the most recent source I've seen isn't sure whether it's K County chert from Oklahoma or Cowlin chert from Illinois. And this one, which is Smoky Hill Jasper from southwestern Nebraska or northern Kansas. It's from the Great Plains. And these things are, I'll show you an image with this turned sideways. I had an opportunity to hold one once, and I was afraid to do it because I was afraid I would drop it and it would break. They're unbearably thin. They're amazing. They're all amazingly made. And this one comes from the Great Plains. So Cahokia grew really, really fast, right? Isotopic chemistry tells us that a third of the people or more came from somewhere else. There's no question about this. And that same chemistry can show that people would be born in Cahokia and then move somewhere else and then come back. Right, so you can see people coming in and out of the center, and they have to go somewhere else, right, to come back. And wherever they went gave them an isotopic bone chemistry that was not Cahokian. So they went a distance, right? So we know that the population of this place was in flux, and we know more than that because people who have looked, Cahokia is down here. The community, the larger community around Cahokia, goes all the way over to the Mississippi and across the Mississippi. It's underneath, much of it is underneath modern St. Louis, right? But this whole area was filled with people all around here, and they all drain, all of the waterways drain into Horseshoe Lake, and that means that everything that drains with the water drains into Horseshoe Lake, and that means that all of the feces that people left behind drain down into Horseshoe Lake. And looking at fecal stanols is one way, the density of them is one way of measuring population. And what that shows, these are sort of archaeological data based, but this is the fecal stanol data. And right at 1,000, it's close to level given these kinds of error margins, but almost immediately, right? So there's this huge pulse of people that come in all at once, and then it starts to drop, and then it drops really precipitously. So even if people were coming back and forth sometimes, there were a lot of people who were there who were just leaving. So people would come into the center and then go away. So we know that there was this flux of population. So go back to the Central Plains quickly, right? Late 1100s, southeastern, expanded 12 and 13s, disappeared 1400, a little later. I'm not going to talk about phases, but there's all these time-space units that people use for convenience. And the only one I'm going to mention, the only term I'm going to use is Steed-Kisker for the material around Kansas City. Right, so we're talking right here. And we're going to look at here and then up here. So the history of excavation has interesting effects on what we know, what becomes typical, and what we name. And the first Steed-Kisker site that was ever dug was the Steed-Kisker site. And it was dug by Waldo Wedel, who found a house that looks like this. So square, 4 center post house, extended entryway, hearth in the center. Looks a lot like those Spirone houses. And in fact, it looks like the typical floor plan for a Central Plains tradition house. And so it should. It's a Central Plains tradition house. And there are others that look like this. But identical artifacts in very closely spaced sites are associated with houses like this. This is a single set post house exactly like those very early houses that you see at Cahokia, the pre-Loman Phase houses, in fact, houses that persisted for a while before wall trench house architecture spread out from Cahokia. This is a partially wall trenched house, partially damaged by construction activities, so we don't know exactly what it looked like, and we may have lost some of the trenches, but that is very much a version of a Cahokian style house, associated with all the same assemblage of pottery and stone tools and things like that. Steed-Kisker pottery is overwhelmingly shell-tempered, which is really unusual for the Great Plains. It's much more typical to find grit-tempered, sand-tempered kinds of pottery, and it's got Mississippian style decoration. I think Wedel referred to it as monotonously constant, or something along those lines when he was describing the Steed-Kisker site assemblage. It's like they did the same thing. Yet that's just because he hadn't seen the Lynch assemblage, where they only used one motif. But right, so these are not right decorated. This is decorated on the shoulder, very low rim, and these handles. That's much more Mississippian, and that's really Mississippian. Right, those are forked die surrounds. No evidence of elites of any kind. It's Steed-Kisker, right? These are not. It's not. I joked one time. I'm not sure, and no one laughed. But I was like Japanese T-shirts, right? If these are meant, if this is elite imagery at Spiro and elite imagery at Cahokia, there's no evidence for elites at Steed-Kisker, but they're still depicting peregrine falcon forked die surrounds on their pots. So they know, right? They know Cahokia. And they know the area around Cahokia. That's it's funny. I ended up saying some of the same things over and over. I can, once I've seen those designs, or once any of you have seen those designs, we can incise them in wet clay, right? This does not require any kind of movement of anything like that. But artifacts that are the stuff of everyday life are a little bit different. So Plains pipes are elbow pipes, almost always. There's a handful of cloud blower pipes, but they're mostly elbow pipes. And this is an unusual kind of an elbow pipe. This is called a Platen style pipe. And it's from it's the kind of pipe that people smoke tobacco in the Mississippi Valley, south of Cahokia, in southeastern Missouri. And it's from a Steed-Kisker site. When you make a Central Plains pot or Plains Village pot, you're typically lump modeling it. And in order to lump model, you usually take a smooth stone and cord wrap the paddle, and you hold the stone against the interior, and then you hammer the paddle and bring the wall of the pot up. And that's what you do unless you're from southeastern Missouri, in which case you use a fired ceramic anvil paddle, pottery anvil, sorry. So you would hold this against the inside of the pot, and these are from Steed-Kisker sites just outside of Kansas City. Right? This is not ideologically loaded kinds of iconography. This is simple manufacturing. These are simple manufacturing tools, and it's the sort of things that people often refer to as habitus. Right? I do this because I do it this way. And that's just the way I do it. And it works for me. And it doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but it's the way that I do it. And it's very much that kind of thing. And this matches them back also to southeastern Missouri, along the Mississippi. But it's not a site unit intrusion. Plains archaeologists have argued about this for years and years, and it is not the variability in the architecture and many other aspects of the site does not. It lets us know that this is not a movement of Mississippian people up the Missouri River to sort of take over. There's lots and lots of Central Plains lithic technology. Here's a diamond bevel knife and an almost diamond bevel knife and a classic Plains end scraper. And there's cord mark pottery present in many Steve Kisker sites, although often at low percentages. And there's this. When Wadel dug Steve Kisker, he also dug the cemetery above the residential area. And it's a natural mound that rises up. And the cemetery is right at the base of the mound, and it encircles the mound. And you remember the Marshall Ashur, woodland style interments on the Central Plains are collective secondary burials. This is spectacularly not a collective secondary burial. And the only way I've ever heard this described that makes any sense is that if every person in there reanimated and sat up, they would all be looking at the back of the head of the person in front of them, right? This is the very definition of an orderly cemetery. And Wadel recovered 80 plus individuals. They're mostly primary. There's a number of secondary burials, but the largest number of secondary burials in there are isolated skulls without the mandible. These are not heads. These are isolated skulls. Very few grave goods and very rarely directly associated with a specific burial. This is the Whiteford burial site. That was that red dot to the west out near Salina, Kansas. It's about 140 to 150 individuals, primary, secondary, and most secondary burials in this one are isolated skulls without the mandibles, and they're individual interments mostly. And I lifted the same text. This is not encircling a natural mound, but there's huge similarities in this mortuary pattern. It is truly not the traditional Central Plains tradition pattern going back into woodland times. It's something different. And we'll come back to those isolated skulls in a minute. When you look at the Whiteford Cemetery pottery, though, it's not that very Mississippian kind of pottery. It's Central Plains tradition pottery, most of it. And it matches. So on the right here, these come out of a village site, CPT community that's right next to it. And then we've got all of these that are essentially the same pot. They're just slightly different size. They're smaller. And the Whiteford Cemetery has these, which are made out of Smoky Hill jasper from the area not too far from the site, north and west of the site. This is that one from Spiro. They're basically the same thing. This was interred with high status burials and in a major religious event. And eastern Oklahoma, these were interred up in a Central Plains tradition cemetery, but they're basically the same object. This one is from Iowa. It's from along the Missouri River. I had an artist draw it. It's from just sort of across the river from Omaha. So we know that they were making these things. These are width thickness ratios of 4 and 5 and 6 to 1. They're really, really skilled knappers making these things, and they're not obviously utilitarian. This one may have some traces of use on it, but these were interred in graves. Right? So this tradition of quite spectacular stone tool production is fairly widespread in Central Plains tradition sites, and extends down into these Mississippian chiefdoms. And these came out of the Whiteford burial. So this is a fragment of a Crockett curvilinear pot, angular version of a curvilinear pot that was probably made down in southeastern Plains and imported there. And this is one of the local cord-mark pots with this curvilinear, not very well executed curvilinear design that sure looks like an imitation of spiral, right? So we see these Mississippian connections, unambiguously Mississippian connections in these earliest areas where we see the transformation of people's lives from hunting and gathering into farming. And then we'll look up here. This is the Grandma Shore. which is really close to the Marshall ossuary. And it's an ossuary, right? Here's, and it's got an old excavation refill, just like the Marshall ossuary did. Here's the pit. Here you can see these small pits coming down into the floor, as if they would use and reuse the same ossuary for a while. And yeah, don't change, stay there. So this, right, for all the world, looks like a woodland period burial, but it lacks all of the shell beads that we would expect to see in a middle or late woodland burial. And it has this, which is a bracelet maybe, or a wrist guard for an archer, and it's hand-eye, right? That is Mississippian hand-eye iconography, but it's in South Central Nebraska. And just here, so here's the Graham ossuary at the top, Marshall ossuary at the bottom. They're truly just a couple of miles apart, and they're the same mortuary customs, right? And when a member of our community dies and we take them to the grave, we take them one at a time. Our cemeteries have many interment events, right? The number of burial events, the number of mourning and grieving events for the community is equal to the number of people in the cemetery. That's individual interments, right? These collective burials will have 20 or 30 sometimes people going to the grave at the same time, interred, not completely intermingled, but interred within the same grave, apparently in the same ceremony. That's a really different statement about community. And we can see both in the Central Plains tradition. We can see many individual interments, and we can see at almost the same time this collective representation of community in these other kind of mourning events. And in fact, ossuary burial is far more common. It is the dominant mode of Central Plains tradition, mortuary practice. So I keep repeating this, so I'm going to lose track of it. There's close ties, this is early part, there's close ties to Cahokia and lower Mississippi Valley, indigenous architecture and Cahokian architecture. How do you build a wall trench house if you have not sat in one or seen other people building it? Somebody had to know how to do that in order for that to happen, right? This is the passage of people back and forth up and down the Missouri River Valley. There are new mortuary patterns associated with this, and there's at least a few groups with ties to the Southern chiefdoms that show similar patterns. It's really weird that there are all those extra skulls at Whiteford and at Steed Kisker, and the bone at Steed Kisker was not in great condition, but at Whiteford, the isolated skulls are said to have been somewhat more weathered. And there is an argument by an archaeologist named Donna Roper, who's no longer with us, that the reason they're there is that what people had done as they made this transition, we're talking about a shift from settled hunting and gathering to maize agriculture that can't have taken more than a generation or two. And that in order to symbolize their claim on land, Donna suggested that they would go back to these late woodland ossuaries or mounds and remove the skulls of their ancestors and inter them in these new cemeteries, right? So that speaks to the rapidity of this change. That if you're going to be a farmer, you need claims to land, you need claims to the land you have fields in, you need claims to fallow land, because you can't constantly, you can't continuously harvest the same plot of land. And that when you do that, having your ancestors buried there is a pretty powerful statement. So we've got these relatively Southern groups that have these close ties to Mississippian groups. But I said Cahokia was emptying out by the mid-1200s, right? And there's an explosion of the Central Plains tradition from the mid-1200s into the 1300s. We see lots and lots of dates that are going on sites that are into the 1300s, and Cahokia was gone. It didn't matter anymore. Spiro was still there, and other centers were still there, but there was almost nothing in the American Bottom at that point. Mid-1200s saw a second incursion into the Great Plains from the upper Midwest, and it happened. The CPT communities, or the CPT way of life, this transformation expanded just as that was happening. We call this second group the Oneota, And they truly, in many cases, seem to be what we would call site unit intrusions. If Steve Kisker's not a Mississippian site unit intrusion, there are Oneota sites that look like they were. And they were really different from Central Plains tradition farmers. Central Plains tradition farmers grew maize, they grew beans, they grew some sunflowers, they harvested lots of wild plants, they hunted a huge array of animals, that whatever was local. We dug a Central Plains tradition site out in western Nebraska, and I have a photograph that shows the wing of probably a turkey, the tail of a bison, and the pelvis of a rabbit laying right next to one another in a trash heap, right? So they're generalist kind of, they're maize horticulturalists. They were maize horticulturalists, but they were generalist kind of maize horticulturalists. Oneota people were not. Oneota people lived in bigger towns, and when you live in a big town on the Great Plains, you subsist with a focus on maize and bison, the two most productive resources that there are on the Great Plains. Oneota is connected to Cahokia, right? Cahokia reached north during Sterling times. Local people interacted with folks. Sometimes they interacted happily, sometimes not so much. And out of that came this kind of ceramic tradition. And that appeared after about 1150 and expanded about 1200. Right, and by 1250, this is the lynch pot, just because it was there. By 1250, they were out here, just as the Central Plains tradition was expanding. These were true people who likely spoke different languages, although we don't know what language Oneota people spoke. People often refer to them as Siouan, and it's a fair guess that Central Plains tradition people spoke a Caddoan language, but these must have been different people. They inhabited the plains landscape in different ways, in truly different ways. They harvested many of the same resources, and they knew each other. There's no question that they knew each other. We can see that in all kinds of evidence. But this was all going on at the same time that the Central Plains tradition was developing and expanding. Right, so you can see here's those Oneota sites. Here are Central Plains tradition sites with Oneota pots in them. Here are Central Plains tradition sites with Mississippian and not Oneota pots in them, and they're virtually mutually exclusive categories. And then there's a group of sites down here, people call Pomona, that have neither, actually. So in southeastern Kansas, there's no evidence, or virtually no evidence, of Mississippian connection. There's one or two Pomona sites that have a pot, but they're at that northern edge, I think. And there's no evidence of agriculture. They had wood. They still built woodland-style houses. They have hunter-gatherer bone chemistry, and they used a mix of newer and older styles of projectiles. We're running out of pictures. So this is lots of words. This is to prompt me because it's getting late. I don't want to forget. So how do we think about the appearance of maize agriculture on the Central Plains? People chose agriculture, right? They did not invent it. They just didn't. They chose agriculture in the context of interaction with socially, politically, and economically complex societies. Why would you do that? That you would get knowledge as people moved back and forth. People might have been moving farther away from Cahokia and increasing your population. But the other thing that maize does is it increases local productivity. And if you can get more food out of the same place, you can support specialists, which is a case we make for complex societies. We haven't made it so much for these other people, but chains of economic connection from the Central Plains all the way into Cahokia were probably really important. It is clear that Cahokia had access to more deer meat than they could possibly have hunted themselves. There is evidence that very strongly suggests that, which means that people were hunting for them and shipping products into them. And if you have hunters that are over hunting, then they need bows and they need arrows and they need people to process the meat and they need people to make canoes to take the meat downriver. And you can see the same thing with bison hunters. And some of that was probably going on. And maize can assist, right? Once the knowledge is there and the seeds are there, you can choose to garden in ways that allow you to support a greater diversity of social roles. There were some people who chose agriculture, but not the social changes that went along with it. We can see that at the Grandma Shore, right? Those were Central Plains tradition farmers. And thank you very much. We don't do the kinds of mortuary practice that people downstream from us do. Some people chose agriculture, probably more northern groups, in the context of movement of new populations into their home territory. Oneota sites truly look like site unit intrusions. Many of them have different architecture, and then the pottery is truly not Central Plains tradition pottery, and stone tools look quite different. So if you've just got more people crowding into a place, there may be just very practical reasons to turn to maize. And there is some evidence that the Stede Kisker bones were in poor condition, and I'm not sure they've ever been analyzed in a modern kind of a way. The Whiteford burial stuff was preserved in place for years by a family that varnished and varnished and varnished the bones so that they could sell tickets to show them to people, and it's now covered with concrete, so that doesn't happen anymore. But it means the bones were never studied in the way they might have. But there's at least one Stede Kisker cemetery that was analyzed, and those folks had a lot of dietary problems and biological stress indicated in their teeth especially. So it may be that there were times and places where people were just stressed and needed the extra food that farming would give them. And so there were some people who didn't choose agriculture at all. And they knew each other, right? They knew each other and lived side by side for centuries. All of these choices may have been operating at the same time. So back to Quanah and Tanarsi, right? How do we think about this? And I'm not, I'd love to say this is, I'll tell you the just so story of exactly how this all happened. I'm not sure I know. I'm pretty sure I don't know. We need to do a lot more work. And some of the stuff that we're doing now is focused on that. The Lynch site we talked a lot about Oneota and Central Plains tradition interaction last night. But we can't think about any of these changes on their own. We can't think of them only as local. There are people who are making really fundamentally important local decisions. I suggested last night that one of the questions that we need to really look hard at is what happens when you clear the bottomland and you cut the trees to build those houses and you change the vegetation like that, and then you put it all in fallow and leave it alone for a while. The towns that we're looking up in northeastern Nebraska had thousands of people in them. We can't avoid that conclusion, I think. But even for the smaller communities that we see, there has to have been an anthropogenic effect on the Central Plains environment, and we just know nothing about it. There's some evidence of stream incision and things like that looks roughly coincident with maize farming, but it's never been studied from that perspective. So there's all of these there are truly local things right in front of people's faces that would have conditioned the choices that they made, but we can't, it's not possible, the kind of things that I've just showed you, tell us that it's not possible to use those local factors by themselves to understand this. And we have to look to that web of social, economic, and other forces that people lived in if we want to think clearly about them. And Quanah didn't just become a rancher, he turned to the Native American church in his later days. That is, as he made these changes, part of that entire web of colonial era pressures that led him to change the life that he probably would not otherwise have changed, and Tanarsi with him and his 8 other wives. He built a big house. That's a big house. It's on the National Register. You could visit it. And apparently he had his whole family in there with him. But it led to profound changes in religious practice. Right? These are the things that we tend to think, and I was brought up to think materially about these kinds of things, behavioral ecology and that kind of perspective. But we can't. We have to look beyond. And the archaeological data on the Central Plains, I think, tells us that unambiguously. I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. It's very open-ended.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You can do the reaction if you prefer, or you can turn on your camera and clip that way too. I hope that we have some time for questions. I know we had talked about having a sort of separate event. Maybe we'll get to that, but I do want to allow people who are here to go ahead and I invite you to either in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask your questions about.
Ricky, I'm really nervous now because I'm recognizing all these names. Hi, Tom Emerson. Hi, John Dorshuk. These are people who know more than me about most of what I just said. So, I'm not, that's just the people I can see on the screen. I don't know who else is here. Let's see who else I should be nervous about.
Well, following up on your last point, I actually, sorry, Carlson, would you like to ask a question? No, okay. Thanks for turning on your camera. I was going to ask a question about religion, since I know this is part of at least, and I will just admit this is way outside my normal realm of thinking about archaeology and past cultures, since I'm much more comfortable with the Mediterranean world. But I know Tim Pauketats argued that religion is part of the Cahokia experience. How do you see that interacting with this picture you've laid out for us about the adoption of maize farming?
It seems, I'm increasingly nervous because I'm looking at Tom Emerson's name there, who could talk about this quite a bit. Much of the imagery that you see on Steve Kisker pots is thought, there's a change in the imagery, but there's a whole set of designs that are thought to be related to fertility and presumably farming and maize production. And then there's a set of designs that seem to be, people have argued are related more to warfare and sort of male status, that show up, that become more frequent later when people serrate the pots. And so there must have been a religious component. The knowledge that the seeds themselves have to be coming from somewhere. There's a little bit of evidence. There is evidence for maize surprisingly early on the southwestern edge of the plains, but that's probably coming out of the Pueblo Southwest. And it's very likely that just to plant, that you can't plant fields if you don't have seeds, and you have to know how to do it. So there must have been a connection into Mississippian societies that's represented in that iconography. What I talked about last night, there's a lot of conversation about aspects of iconography in some areas. There's things like Raymie pots. There's some really detailed and I think really convincing interpretations of what they meant and the purposes, that the roles that they played. People have done the same thing for Oneota, but people have not done very much about this with the Central Plains tradition. We can see that there are these Mississippian style designs going on the shoulders of a very small number of pots. And we can see Oneota designs going onto those other pots. But as talked about this last night, there's a site up in northeastern Nebraska that's enormous, and that it looks like it was one giant community. And when they decorated their rims, of the 40 or 50 motifs that have been recorded in other places, they chose basically one. And they put parallel horizontal lines on their rims, and they did that for 100+ years. In 4 or 5 communities up this one drainage. And it's just like, it's got to mean something, right? That's not a random choice. And then they stopped doing it. They moved north into South Dakota, and they began to elaborate their choices more. But in this one interval, they just didn't. And I'm not sure we really understand what those kinds of things mean, but I think we need to think a lot harder about them. That's the easy thing to say. Somebody else needs to think really hard about this. Tell me. There's questions in the chat. Hang on. I have to leave. Thank you. You're welcome. Hey, Arcade. I will, if you're still here, I will email you. That just for the record, we had a middle school student who's deeply interested in archaeology and is really excited about having found the AIA, which I guess he found a little while ago. So he sent me a picture of a potsherd. I have to email him back.
It's pretty exciting when you find potsherds, I have to say. But then I quite like potsherds. So
yeah. I had to learn it. Actually, it took me quite a while to I'm far from an expert on plains pottery, but I've learned a huge amount. I had to. I'm working on surrounding period sites now. So I've gotten over myself, I think is the way to put it. So,
Other questions out there for Professor Bamforth?
Doug, may I ask a question?
yeah, hey, John.
What happens environmentally after about 1350 or so that led to widespread abandonment by 1400? What's going on? Was that maize farming overdone or what?
I mean, I've left the environment. I've made myself leave. I love materialist environmental explanations. I do, because they're really important. I'm not quite an unreconstructed environmental determinist. I'm not, but I'm also not foolish enough to think that the practical things that practical problems we have to solve don't matter, which, it seems like a lot of people do sometimes. There was a huge, this explosion of Oneota population on the Central Plains, and the expansion of the Central Plains tradition also overlaps with this immense drought in the late 1200s, 1276, 1275, up to 1300 or a little bit later. And then there was a series of later droughts in the 1300s as well. The 1400s, the early 1400s were good times.
Mm.
So, and at that point, I got an email from the editor of Plains Anthropologist, who, Carlton, you'll be pleased. He forgot to tell me that he gave us the final acceptance for the paper, but he said he was sending it into final production. So I don't know if he forgot to tell me. I don't think I missed the email, but we have a paper on radiocarbon, including the lynch site stuff that apparently is going to be out in Plains later this year, I think. 1400 is not a bad end date on the radiocarbon dates, but back in the 1930s, Paul Cooper dug a site south of Omaha on the Nebraska side of the Missouri that has a pot in it that is made, it's really strange, but it is exactly like pots, like 15th century pots in southeastern Missouri, the same place where we see Platen style pipes and things like that. And so there's no way that there weren't people living along Missouri at that period of time, because they were making local versions of this Mississippian style pot. So it lingered into that way of life, must have lingered in at least a few places into the 1400s. And then it's just gone. And the big question is, were there still people in Nebraska, not the whole state, but the eastern half of Nebraska into the 1400s, or was it just empty? And anthropogenic problems are not a bad thing to wonder about, I think, in that context. I need a geomorphologist. I can probably get money, but I don't have a geomorphologist. We're taking applications.
Not I. Thank you, Doug. Well done.
Thank you.
I have a question here in the chat asking what
I'm so
happened.
bad at watching, sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm happy to be the chat watcher. What happened in the 1050s, early 1100s that sparked the start of stationary agriculture in the Great Plains region? Was it spread south in Mexico, or was it independent development?
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, all maize comes from Mexico, but it didn't come to the Great Plains from Mexico. It came up into the Pueblo Southwest from Mexico, and then it somehow found its way into the eastern woodlands. And there's conversations about how that might have happened. Did it spread up the Texas coast somehow? It turns out it's easy to hop through the island hopping through the Caribbean to Florida is also not a bad way to get maize from Mexico to the eastern part of North America. But however it got there, it took a little while apparently to adapt to the North American and to the United States, the northern North American environment. And then it seems to have come to the plains out of the eastern woodlands. So I think that I mean what I think the trigger in the moment in the late 1100s for bringing it out, let me backtrack slightly. I left out everything north of and Nebraska and virtually all of Iowa, I think. And there were things happening in Iowa and the Dakotas that are a little bit different than this. So people turned to maize farming in Iowa. You can call them late woodland, or you can call them early Plains village, either one, but they were hardcore maize farmers. And that seems to have been a local change, and I'm not sure anybody really understands why that happened. And then Cahokia arose, and there were massive changes up there. So we know that there was farming next to the plains for something that has not, for some reason that has nothing to do with the rise of complex societies. As soon as complex societies arose, though, things began to change. And what I'm trying to wonder about here is why that would have, what would have been the mechanism, what would have been the process that involves Plains people and these people to the east who they'd clearly known for centuries in ways that would transform their lives like this. And I think it has to do with, I think, social and economic and political kinds of considerations, this rising and falling and ebbs and flows of population and economic opportunities, I think have a lot to do with it. And those are things that often don't enter into the conversation about this.
Hi, Doug. Tom Emerson here.
Hey, Tom.
I feel obligated to.
Can you take the lecture over now? Would that be okay?
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the recent work we just did on the entry of corn into Cahokia at 900
I saw the title.
AD. And so it's really interesting because the pathways that we saw were through northern Colorado, through the Colorado Plateau, where you have corn pre-adapted to northern environments, and it makes a logical pathway. How it actually got there is a different issue. The plains is kind of a black hole in terms of our model for how it moves east. But the interesting thing at Cahokia, I think, is to understand it's not there before 900 AD, period. And the dietary isotopes show that, and the radiocarbon dates show it, along with, of course, the strontium that shows migration. So it's really a quandary. it's not something I have an answer for, but it kind of really revises my thinking about the role of corn in the eastern woodlands. And there's some reason to suspect, I think, that it's a late phenomena. And coming at Cahokia, it is a coming together of religion, population movement, population nucleation, and maize all co-occur within about 100 years. But again, the explanation is people, not the environment, although those are good conditions. I'm being trained by Dave Barris in environmental archaeology probably 50 years ago. It's like I was stuck in that rut for a long time, but now I'm a true believer. It's all about people.
I find my mind opening as I age. So I've been sitting on a radiocarbon date for a number of years because I want to rerun it, but I've actually never told this to anyone. So back in the 1940s, Asa Hill, who was Waldo Wadel's mentor, the first director of the Nebraska Historical Society, dug a little site out in Chadron State Park, which is almost in Wyoming, right? It's almost in the Black Hills. It's as far north and west as you can get in Nebraska. And he pulled out a bunch, it was some kind of a house, and the pottery looks mostly like Central Plains tradition pottery, but it's pretty plain, and it's got these woodland traits, and he's got side notch points and things like that. But they got a little bit of maize out of it, and they saved a little bit of it. And it's not well documented. The site's not well documented. It was uncharacteristic for Hill. But I was working on a site just east of there, and I radiocarbon dated his maize. And I haven't ever mentioned it because it came out in the 800s.
Okay.
And so I want to rerun it. I'm a little concerned that there was a preservative or something on there, and I need to try it. But if you're looking towards the Colorado Plateau, we're way out in the west, and it turns out that, I don't know, the Plains Conference year before last was in Indiana, and folks from South Dakota mentioned that they've got dates on, I think, beans from the Black Hills that are uncomfortably old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, beans in Illinois are 1300.
Yeah, no, I was listening to this, and it was like this is not right. These dates have to, these dates have to be wrong. They don't fit anything I already know, so they can't be true. So I think there's some, I mean, I need to rerun this one, but I think there's a lot of things that we don't understand. But all the chronological stuff on the Central Plains has been to pull all the early days away, right? So it's pulled up later on in time, which fits what you're talking about.
Yeah, I worked with Mary Simon, and she's systematically eliminated virtually every middle woodland and early late woodland date in Illinois by going back and actually redating the actual maize.
Yep.
And it's either not maize or it's post AD 1000. So it's been a fun project.
Yeah, Mary Adair did some of that. There was maize that was supposed to be from Kansas City Hopewell context, and it's just not.
Yeah, exactly. I just comment on one brief thing too about Raymie iconography. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Raymie in the American bottom is part of a very complex religious and elite system. But once that moves out of the American bottom, it's simply incorporated by people as the design motif that probably has power and influence because it comes from Cahokia, but it's a totally different social setting. And you find that north too. When you go north from Cahokia, it loses its I guess its power in terms of elite, connotations. It may have religious connotations, but again, that's a different issue. So
yeah, and I think that's there's some fourfold symmetry in that Steve Kisker stuff, but there's pretty obviously other kinds of, they're not doing it the right way.
Right.
Even when they're incorporating these kinds. I joke about Japanese T-shirts, but it's a little bit of that.
Joe Tiffany from Iowa has always razzed me about like Raymie knockoffs.
Yeah.
Once you leave the American bottom, you get all these Raymie knockoffs. Everybody copying it, but they're clueless what it means.
Yeah.
Good talk. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming. I saw your name and it made me nervous.
I didn't want to let you get by with it.
No, and you shouldn't either. You should correct all the things that got wrong.
I have one more question out of the chat for you that's about the skulls that Donna Roper discussed. And the question is, might bone chemistry tell us if she was right about moving skulls to new cemeteries to inter them as part of new villages? Would the moved skulls show different chemical signatures?
I'm not seeing it in my chat.
It was directly to me, so I was asking on behalf.
We must, if it were possible to do more human bone chemistry on human skeletons from the Central Plains, we probably could learn a lot, but the fact is that it's not. So in principle, of course, we could do a lot more, but in practice, my tribe of archaeologists has not forged the kinds of relationships that you would need with indigenous people, with Plains tribes that might someday allow us to do that work. I mean, I think we're doing much better, but huge amounts of stuff has been reburied, and no one will ever see it again. So that ship may have sailed.
Any last questions for Professor Bamforth?
Let me thank John. Thank you, John. I will find that. The Wall Ridge. That's okay. I will check. Thank you.
Wonderful. So with that, let's give one final thanks to Professor Bamforth. If you want to stick around for some less formal discussion, I will stop recording so we may do so. But thank you again so much, Doug Bamforth, for joining us here in Western Illinois virtually to talk about maize farming.